Hello there, amazing person. You are amazing. You are special. Thank you very much for listening to Stand Up. I've got a great guest for you. Joining me today is Robert P. Jones. Robbie Jones is the author of several very important books, including most recently, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. I talked to him about that. It's now out in paperback and so much more. If you want to skip ahead, it begins at 7 minutes after the news. But right now, I've got your news headlines and clips. I hope you are doing okay here on Wednesday. It's the 4th of September. I'll be headed out to Las Vegas late Saturday night. I'll be spending most of the week out there trying to do everything I can to get the vote out and whatever I can to help Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and Democrats down the ballot win in Nevada and swing states. Hopefully I'll be coming to Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania as well in the final 63 days before Election Day, November 5th. What are you doing to help get the vote out? Let me know what efforts you're making, because I will steal them or I will try to enhance or support them perhaps. standupwithpete@gmail.com. And even the tiniest things like ripping down a Trump sign on public property. I don't think anybody should ever take down signs on people's property. I think it's dumb and dangerous to walk on someone's yard or property and take down their fascist MAGA signs or whatever signs anybody has up. But if you put them up in public, I'll take them down, because there's one right near my place and it's way up on this telephone pole about 10 feet tall. So I went and got a big long stick out of my house and I ripped it down and posted it on social media for your pleasure. Go check it out. Whatever it takes, my friends, whatever it takes. All right, here are your headlines. Let's start with this horrific attack, maybe the worst since the Russian invasion into Ukraine proper started. 2 Russian ballistic missiles struck a military training facility and nearby hospital in a central eastern region of Ukraine, killing at least 47 people, wounding over 200 others, according to Ukrainian officials. The strike appeared to be one of the deadliest carried out by Russian forces since the invasion more than 900 days in February 2022. Let's go to the Democratic Republic of Congo. At least 129 people were killed there during an attempted jailbreak at the country's largest prison. Looks and sounds like a terrible situation. In France, at least 12 people died after a boat carrying migrants trying to cross the English Channel capsized off the northern coast, and just absolutely horrific. That's those last 3 headlines. In Albania, local landowners are questioning how Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were able to sew up development rights for 2 new luxury hotels on hot coastal property. Oh, I wonder how they did it. The campaign to vaccinate 650,000 children under 10 for polio in Gaza has been more successful than anticipated. Finally, a decent news headline. According to the World Health Organization, health workers have delivered vaccines to more than 160,000 children, in the territory so far. And now let's come home to domestic news. A federal judge has issued an injunction prohibiting Donald Trump from playing his favorite song that he dances to at the end of each rally. I think that's great. Trump aides evacuated their offices after listening devices were found in the offices. It was later determined the devices were likely to be a prank. That's not right, is it? And I thought this was an interesting story in the Washington Post. For a growing number of men, abortion has become an issue in the 2024 election. In a story in the Post yesterday, several men who had considered themselves anti-abortion had a change of heart after seeing the real-life consequences of abortion bans in their states. Reporter there spoke with several men from deep red states who consider themselves very religious or against any kind of abortion, who've changed their opinions on medically ending pregnancies after their own loved ones faced literal life or death situations with their own pregnancies, which is super frustrating when that has to happen, when you have to have your own direct life experience before you start caring about people. And that's always been a terrible way to create policy and a support policy. I understand sometimes it's natural, but I was raised to care about and think about people that I can't necessarily relate to their situation or their circumstances, but that I should advocate for those who have less to create more opportunity. And of course, for people who are in great danger because they could die if their pregnancy isn't terminated. So it's pretty outraged to have to read that, but still, I'll take the progress. All right. Those are your headlines. And unfortunately, I don't have any sound bites for you because I had a catastrophic computer failure after working on it for about 90 minutes. And then I cried and shouted a little bit and then conceded that today's show would be without the sound montage that I put together for you, which was pretty good. But shit happens when you are running an operation alone with 3 computers and a mixer. And frankly, it's a miracle that I pull it off as well as I do, even with all the errors and mistakes on a regular basis. So I am very sorry about that. Believe me. But I do have this great conversation with Robbie Jones coming for you now. And that is most of why you listen to the show, I like to think. It's the interviews, the amazing experts and brilliant folks that I have as my guests on my show because of the work I put into this program for almost 15 years now and the credibility that I've built with so many amazing people and publicists and contacts. It's the social capital, the people that I know that I like to think makes this daily program so valuable. And today, man, what an impactful and important guy that we've got for you. He's the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, which is a very, very important organization. His writing on religion, culture, and politics has appeared in all of the major publications. He's a frequent commentator on all of the major shows, TV, radio, and more. He's got a Ph.D. in religion. He's got a master's in divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And he's the author of 3 great books. White Too Long, which won the 2021 American Book Award. The End of White Christian America in 2019. And last year, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. It's out in paperback with a new afterword. So good. It's Dr. Robert P. Jones back on Stand Up. Robert P. Jones is back. Thank you very much for joining me, and congratulations on the paperback version of this very important book coming out. It is so important. I'm really happy to talk to you again, Robbie.
Hey, I'm really glad to be back on.
It's been quite a year. Has happened, and so much of it correlates to your work, the work of your organization. And I guess I just want to ask you what I think is the most topical question based on your work. What have you seen change in polling, and what have you seen change in the country since we've seen the change of the candidates in the presidential race? Going from Biden to Harris changed everything. So what did it change the way that you see things, the way patterns, trends in polling?
What's interesting about the polling, it certainly has changed the mood of the Democratic Party. I think it's changed the energy level. It's changed engagement. I think particularly for young people and women, all that's true. What's a little remarkable, though, is if you really move away from, I think, the palpable energy that you can see. And certainly, I would say that, man, it would have been such a different Democratic convention had it been Biden at the top of the ticket rather than Kamala at the top of the ticket. So clearly we saw it all there. What's interesting, though, is that it hasn't really fundamentally shifted the polling that much, whereas Biden was a little bit down, Kamala was a little bit up. And I think the media has really hyped it a lot more than you see. So even if you look at the polling averages now, the same thing has been true that has been true for weeks and weeks. It's essentially a toss-up. And so you see little movements, but none of the movements have actually been outside of the margin of error for all of these polls. If you look at a state poll, it's usually maybe 800, at most 1,000 voters. So there's a margin of error plus or minus 3 points for each of those findings. And so far, and particularly if you look at the battleground states, it's just a tight race. It's a toss-up.
You do this work for a living, part of your work, polling. So how much faith do you have in it, especially given the date of the election? The proximity matters, right?
Yeah, I always remember what polls are for and what they're not for. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made is, and say this to someone who runs a polling organization, is to think of them as something like magic oracles that are going to tell us the future. What polls are is they are a snapshot of public opinion at a point in time. And I always think that every poll we read, we should read it with the same kind of reflection and circumspection that we do with our retirement accounts, where there's a little footnote at the bottom of your retirement statement that says past performance is no guarantee of future success. And I think we ought to have that disclaimer really firmly in mind for every poll that we see. We see them there. I do have the constructed polls with good methodology. I still have some confidence in them, but they are not really designed to tell us what is going to happen on a given day when an entire nation of hundreds of millions of people turned out to vote.
Got to also just ask you about the assassination attempt and how that played out in the world of Christian nationalism, in MAGA world, and some of what you saw as a reaction to that. Because a lot of prophecies, I think, came out as a result of that horrific day.
Well, there's a lot of really bad theology that got rolled out in the wake of that. That also has just if you only take that event, what we've mostly focused on is the fact that there was evidently a near miss, right? That some fragment of a bullet or something grazed Donald Trump's ear. But there was actually someone who died there, who was shot and killed, a father at the rally. And so if you think about this theology, Trump, the evidence that he dodged this bullet was like evidence of God's election and favor and his chosenness. But it doesn't take you very long if you really take that theology. Are you really going to say then that the father who was protecting his children, who was killed by that bullet, is that theology really going to say also that guy deserved to die, or that God somehow wanted that guy to die and was protecting Trump? Like, it just falls apart pretty quickly. But one other thing I'll say, though, is that Trump had already been setting himself up as a kind of messianic figure, right, among kind of white conservative Christian people. And so even on the stump before this event, he was using bullets and arrows as metaphorical props. He was saying things like, I'm taking the arrows for you. I'm taking the bullets for you. I'm being indicted for you. All right. And so in the ways that I'm getting wounded, they're really after wounding you. So he'd been already using these kind of violent metaphors to talk about himself as the sacrificial lamb on their behalf, which of course is all this kind of messianic, feeds into that kind of messianic prophecy.
So let's talk about your book. It is out in paperback now, and I've talked all about it in the intro, obviously, and then we've done an interview about it before, but I realized as I went back and actually listened to that interview, oh man, did I not scratch the surface in our first conversation, which people can go back and listen to. It's such an important book in addition to your work, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Tell folks a little bit about what you hope to accomplish, because when I read this, it's so impactful and so informative. It's really a history book, and to some extent, it's the history that we never learned.
I think that's right. This is certainly the most history. I'm a social scientist by training, not a historian, but I realized that to tell the story that I wanted to tell and do the analysis that I felt like I needed to do in this book, I did have to go back and do a lot of history. And I guess one of the things I've tried to do is to go back and look and say, all right, look, we know we've had this horrific history with civil rights and discrimination, but how far back does it go and where does it come from? And that's really how I was trying to get back to the roots of it. And I trace it back in the book really to a Christian doctrine. That's going to come as a surprise maybe to many listeners, but that was called the doctrine of discovery. It comes all the way back to the colonial period, or the 15th century colonial period. And it was this idea that God had actually reserved all of these newly discovered lands for the use and exploitation of European Christians. Yeah. And that idea drove the entire colonial project. It drove the enslavement and kidnapping of Africans and their importation into these lands. It drove the treatment of indigenous people, genocide, displacement as well. And so I was trying to hold all that history together and ask, what is it that explains that? And it really is this fundamental idea that Europeans had gotten this kind of divine commission, really, and those documents not only say that Europeans have the right to take their goods, take their lands, but it like explicitly spells out that Europeans have the kind of blessing of the church and the power of the state to submit their persons to perpetual slavery. Right. That's in the kind of Christian documents there. And so if you think about that idea, our biggest fights today are still really over who is this country for, right? Who belongs, who are real Americans. That's going to run all through the campaign this year. And it is this very old question, right? Are we a pluralistic democracy where everybody stands on equal footing, regardless of race or religion? Or are we a kind of divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? This very old idea that actually predates the Republic.
So many Americans today, young people and my age and older, don't even know about that doctrine that they actually believe and follow. Is that fair to say?
I confess in the book that I knew very little about it. And when I've I got a Ph.D. in religion and went to graduate school and I went to have a seminary degree and yet get very little kind of attention to that teaching. And really, I came across it reading indigenous scholars for whom it is absolutely, they see it very clearly as the source of, again, domination, genocide, displacement, and the treatment of indigenous people here.
Say a little bit more about the opening of the book, which before America is the prologue, and then we get to Mississippi and Minnesota, Oklahoma, and the conclusion. And it's every part of it is just mind-blowing and so educational. But just the early discoverers, they went back and got permission to enslave and rape and kill in the name of their religion, their form of Christianity, right?
No, that's right. And when we see these paintings, in fact, there's one in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda right now, big 8-foot by 12-foot painting in the Rotunda that features Hernando de Soto coming into, he's on the banks of the Mississippi River. And there's many people have seen these images where you have these kind of European conquistadors in their military garb and they're erecting a cross. And so they've got all their military equipment, but the painting picks them they're standing in an indigenous village and they're erecting a cross in the middle of the indigenous village with all of their weapons there. And it really is perfect depiction of what's justifying it all is this perception of this kind of divine mandate, right? That they have God's permission to go and really dominate the people who are here.
Take your land as well.
Yeah, take your land, take your goods, enslave the people.
Yeah, yeah. I've got to ask you, obviously, about the first part, but just want to taking place in Mississippi, part one, the Delta, talking about Emmett Till and more. I just got to tell you, I just interviewed almost accidentally because I had no idea how out there he was. Shad White, who's the auditor of Mississippi. You grew up in Mississippi.
I did.
And are you familiar with this guy?
I don't know him, no. Mm-mm.
He's the auditor there, and he's written a book, and that's why I had him on. The book was about the corruption between the government and the way they made this big deal with Brett Favre and the way they used welfare money to build a volleyball arena. I'm sure you heard about the controversy. And he, as the auditor, broke that wide open. But come to find out, he's a huge Trumper. Big MAGA guy, Christian, but he's been going just crazy about DEI in Mississippi schools, and you've seen that campaign. And so I just wanted to ask you just about that general idea, because your book educates and elucidates and teaches us or gives us more specifics on the history that we never learned. And there's obviously a good argument, always has been since Howard Zinn wrote his books and others, to tell a different kind of history or another history in addition to. And I just wanted to get your take on where you see that current movement in states like Florida and others where they've banned dozens of books for the craziest of criteria, when in fact we should all be reading your work and the work of your colleagues. So I just want to ask you where you thought that movement was and how insidious and successful it's been, given my conversation with this guy.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Howard Zinn. I mean, I very much see my book in that vein, in the kind of vein of Howard Zinn's work, trying to uncover the history that we never got taught.
For sure.
You mentioned Emmett Till, and I did grow up in Mississippi, but just to give you an example of how limited like my own education was in Mississippi. So when I graduated high school, and I graduated at the top of my class, learned everything that the state of Mississippi asked me to learn in public school there. And I had learned, I think I knew Emmett Till's name, but I could not have told you more than a sentence about who he was and what happened in Mississippi. And the name that I didn't know at all was Medgar Evers. Right. All right. And Medgar Evers was shot and killed 9 miles from my driveway growing up. Right. And yet I never learned that history. And that's not accidental, of course. Right. This was a very intentional hiding of that kind of history. And so we've been going through this period, I think, of a kind of racial reckoning and a realization of how literally whitewashed our history has been, that we've taught in public schools. And there's been this quest to say, we're going to tell a truer story, a more inclusive story about who we are and how we got here. And I think what we're seeing now is this backlash to that movement. And I do see it just as a backlash to this kind of positive movement to tell the truth. Right. And we can't understand who we are, our current conflicts, if we don't know the truth about how we got here. And I think that those movements, the anti-DEI, anti-critical race theory things, are all these kind of reactionary movements to try to keep a lid on a white supremacist history. right, that we've been taught.
The most I feel like obvious is not the anti-DEI and the CRT and all that, which they've been able to so easily demagogue, but not teaching African American history. That has now become specifically the history of African Americans. Black folks in America are as important as any part of our story, if not one of the most important parts. And they're trying to opposite and censor. That to me seems
it's pretty bold and it's pretty bald, I would say, right? And what they're up to. You,
sir, say such a thing to me.
I didn't mean it that way, but it certainly isn't hiding the ball, right? It's very clear what they're up to here. And the state of Arkansas has made some efforts to ban AP African American history from being an accredited course in high schools in Arkansas. There's some other efforts underway as well. And it's just so clearly and nakedly about suppressing that history.
I love when we taught, and I know you've taught to you're a scholar, a student. You went to school with Eddie Glaude, who wrote a book about James Baldwin, and you look up to James Baldwin and his work a lot. And the question is how white folks and how black folks see this history differently. Not that young black people are learning this stuff either, and not necessarily learning it in school. They might learn some different things at home, but how they see American history and how they see present day America and whiteness and how we are learning a lot. And often, as Baldwin talked about it, black folks know what's going on. They know what's been going on.
There's a great passage. I'm not going to be able to quote it from Baldwin, though, where he says, black people have never been under the illusion that, all of our ancestors or all of the founding fathers were all freedom-loving heroes, and we were always virtuous, and we never did anything wrong. We always treated people justly. Like that kind of thin, patriotic version of history that many of us received is certainly not one that I think resonates with most African Americans. And certainly Baldwin, will say that my previous book, White Too Long, especially was very much centered around really what I would learn and relearned about history, really with much credit to Baldwin, who really opened my eyes, I think, in ways that started me on the journey that I'm still on.
Let's talk about Minnesota. I don't think we talked about it in our first conversation. Yeah. And obviously I actually forgot. I did forget for a moment that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. I don't know why, just my brain told me it was New York. And I remember obviously the horrible video and so on. But then as Tim Walz obviously became the VP, a lot of people went back to Minnesota and how he handled that as governor. But you start long before that. Why Minnesota?
So in the book, I talk about three communities, Mississippi and Oklahoma. And so I also wanted to not just be in the South, right? And because the point is that this story that I'm telling about the doctrine of discovery and rights to land and exploitation of indigenous and African people isn't a Southern story. It's not a Confederate story. It's an American story. So I really wanted to be able to see how does that look in another state. Can't get much further north than Minnesota. And so I went to Duluth, Minnesota, and there's a story there about a lynching of 3 African-American men in the 1920s. And again, what's remarkable about this is if I just told you the story and didn't tell you where we were, and I said, look, these 3 men were falsely accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, which of course is like the stereotypical trumped up charge to get black men lynched. And then 3 of them were lynched and 10,000 people turned out for the lynching, right? And that's a tenth of the population of the town. You would think we were in Alabama or Mississippi, but this is Duluth, Minnesota, right at the tip of the Great Lakes. They're not far from Canada. And so I want to tell that story. And then what I've done in each of the states, too, is to tell the story behind that story. And that is that there was also this violence against Native Americans in the state of Minnesota. In fact, the biggest mass execution that a U.S. government agency has carried out was actually in Mankato, Minnesota, when 38 Dakota men were hung simultaneously. And the person who signed off on that was none other than Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I learned about the Dakota War of 1862. It's such a fascinating and terrifying history, and you've documented it so well in this book. Talk a little bit about the commemoration and repair that takes place in Minnesota, which you also have a section on in each of these places, Mississippi, Minnesota, and Oklahoma, which I think is important.
Yeah, that's right. I did try in each place not only to talk about the history of racial violence there, but the history of, and many of this kind of current history of efforts to repair the damage, right? To tell the truth and repair the damage. That's really what it comes down to. And there are communities in each of those places doing that. In Duluth, it really came down to a small band of people. Really, that story about the lynching in Duluth had really been suppressed. Like it had gone away. People didn't know it. And there was a handful of people that said, we should really tell the truth about this history. We should do some commemoration to try to do something about righting the wrong here. And so it was actually a group of 3 people to begin with that kind of began the process of telling the truth. And they initially just wanted to put a commemorative plaque there. But it turns out they've now got an entire plaza on the kind of one of the major street corners in downtown Duluth that has this beautiful frieze of the 3 men and these inspirational quotes. And it's a reminder and an invitation, right, to live into a different future.
I hate to do it because it doesn't do the book justice, but before I let you go, I obviously want to talk about Oklahoma. People have become more Americans have become more and more familiar with this. Your book does a great job about talking about the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, and people are a little bit familiar with it, but I think they're not reading the way that you write about it, learned about it, and wrote about it, and your book gives so much more detail. What do you like to focus on when you're talking about it? Again, everybody should read it. I can't possibly do it justice.
I think one kind of hook we've had recently is the Killers of the Flower Moon book, I think, told part of this story. And and if you saw the movie, there is a little part in a newsreel where they not only is this awful confiscation of indigenous oil rights happening and this is again in the 1920s, but at the same time is when there is, again, it starts with one African-American man being accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. And then it just spins out of control. And by the time it's all said and done, the entire African-American section of Tulsa has been burned to the ground, right, by roving bands of vigilante other white neighbors, essentially. And over several days, like this is not just one, that's the thing that always struck me about it. It's not just one out of control event. Like people committed violence, went home, had dinner with their family, got a good night's sleep, came out the next day and did it again. Crazy. Right? That's the kind of premeditated effort that this was. And then there's this effort again and it was a decades-long effort, right? We heard about it at its 100th anniversary, but it was a decades-long effort to try to tell the truth about this event and to move toward healing.
Sometimes white people, I think, including myself, have a hard time comprehending that kind of violence and the lack of consequences, so to speak. But like when I think it's important that white people especially, think of those white people who did those things and want to do those things today as terrorists. Hamas on October 7th and what they did to those Israeli young people. When you think about the Tulsa, what you just described there, you're in your home, minding your own business as a black family, and your white neighbors, come and destroy your home and kill you and your family. Those are terrorists. That's the worst kind of terrorism. So I just wanted to rant about framing that a little bit more, because it shouldn't be that hard for people to see just because they look like us, or they might even be our family.
Oh yeah, no, there's no doubt. These were acts of domestic terrorism, and I'm with you on this. And what's remarkable about it is that, how they were spun after the fact, right? And spun, in many cases, like in Tulsa, by leading the preachers in the pulpits, right, after the fact, to try to cover it up, to try to justify it, like wouldn't face it. And I think it's one of the big sea changes is I write in the book about one church in particular, Boston Avenue Methodist Church, that was one of the key churches that justified the violence at the time and has also become one of the key churches repenting of their role in doing that 100 years later.
Really important. Talk to me about the edition and the paperback version of your book. What's new? Everybody should get it.
Yeah, so the new paperback is out September 10th. Excited about that. But I have a little afterword at the end. And what I wanted to do is to try to think about, all right, I've done all this deep history, but how does it relate to 2024? How do we see it manifesting itself in 2024? And as I said at the beginning, I do think this fundamental question of who we are, like who is the country for, who is it of, by, and for, who are the real Americans? Like those are the questions that are at the heart of our current politics. So in the afterword, where that manifests itself today is in Christian nationalism. That's the word we use to talk about this movement that is the inheritor of that long claim that this country is a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians. The current Christian nationalist movement is making exactly those claims. So I nail it down and look at the ways that the Trump campaign and the MAGA movement is rooted in that idea, and then also pull out some data. One remarkable piece of data is that we actually looked at support for Christian nationalism all the way down to the state level. We have a big 20,000 person survey that allows us to look all the way down at the state level. And what's remarkable, if you look at among white Americans, there's a nearly perfect correlation between support for Christian nationalism and support for Trump.
Yeah.
Like you could just see how tightly that is driving support for Trump. It literally, if you were going to write a textbook about correlation, I've got a chart in there that just looks like almost like it's fake data because it's just so tightly aligned.
Really?
Between
that is just underscore that. You write about it,
yeah.
But just be specific that what the data says about Christian nationalists and Trump supporters. That's crazy.
Yeah. So essentially it just says this: among white Americans, the more likely you are to support the tenets of Christian nationalism, and that are ideas like the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation, U.S. law should be based on the Bible, like those kinds of statements. The more you affirm those statements, the more likely you are to support Donald Trump for president. It is like a nearly perfect correlation. And not just at the national level, even if we go state by state, you can plot the states among white people and you can just see this kind of 45-degree trend line going through. So like my home state of Mississippi is one of the states that has the highest rate of people affirming Christian nationalism. It is also the highest states supporting Donald Trump. States like Washington, Massachusetts are the lowest ones who have among where white people support Christian nationalism. They are the lowest support for Trump. You can just see how this idea is driving the whole MAGA movement.
Let me just ask you about Project 2025 and any gender-related issues, which are also obviously often intersect with Christian nationalist beliefs, whether it be women's reproductive rights, or the women's role in the home, or even if you don't have to dig too much to ask them if they think women should have the right to vote.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. I think before I get into specifics, I think one of the more disturbing things in Project 2025 is when they're talking about liberty and what they mean by liberty here is they actually say in Project 2025 that their understanding of liberty is not that we should be all as citizens be able to do what we want, but we should only be able to do what we ought. Right. And now who gets to determine the ought? It's the white Christian nationalists, right? They get to determine the ought. So their view, their hierarchical view of patriarchal families, their idea of only heterosexual people having rights, like it is all there, right? But is this like really not shying away from saying, no, it's this limited vision of how we conceive of liberty that's the only thing everybody's going to get under this worldview.
Very important. Were you going to add to that the specific gender issue?
Oh, yes, absolutely. This idea, it goes along with, the worldview here. It's a very hierarchical worldview, and that's just what's coming through, right? It is white people over non-white people. It is Christians over non-Christians. And as you're talking about here, it is men over women, right? And women have a subordinate place. And we've heard from J.D. Vance that, and others who are out of that worldview, that for women, the most important thing they could do is be married and have kids, right? That's the fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment of their life. And that, again, this is a very old vision of patriarchy and misogyny, right, that is locked into this broader worldview. And it's a hierarchy they're trying to bring into all of our communities.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that and talk about everything we're talking and you write about and work on every day, that one view there about women and their role. It's been long held, but J.D. Vance and others have updated it with new language and new events talking about what they're teaching in college or public schools, but specifically saying things like cat ladies and so on. That's new language, but the same old ideas. And it would be one thing if he had only said that once. But it turns out that J.D. Vance has said it in interview after interview about women and their role. You've seen it from that kicker from the Kansas City Chiefs in that speech, that graduation speech at that Christian college. They're really very overt about it, but sometimes they just use new language. They talk about things that are happening in today's world, but it's the same old archaic patriarchy, right?
No, I think that's right. And just with Vance, he's been given several opportunities to walk that cat lady statement back and just hasn't done it. If anything, he's just doubled down on it.
Yeah, no, you're right about that every time. I'll let you go, but I hate to, and I fear I still didn't get specific enough with this amazing book. Everybody's got to get it and read it and learn everything that's in it, and obviously support PRRI.org. Robert P. Jones, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor.
All right. Thanks so much, Pete.
And there he goes, Robert P. Jones. Everybody, go get the book. Go support him on Substack. He's got a great Substack. I think I forgot to mention at the beginning, robertpjones.substack.com. Follow him on Twitter. Let him know that you heard him here and know that I cannot do this show without your support. Thank you. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And thanks to everybody who has sent me a little bit extra for the Swing State Tour. I'm headed to Vegas on Saturday, and I can use your support there. John Carroll writes all the music for this show, including this amazing song, johncarroll.org. Take it away, John.
That's the time you gotta finally get up on your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.